It's the extra poo that makes all the difference.
All right, here we are. The game is God of Weapons. It's a little snacky affair that came out from Archmage Game Studios, or Archmage Labs, one or the other. They're probably the same outfit, but who knows? You know, just because there's two guys named Dwayne and they have different last names, they're two different people. You would make that assumption, but it says here that it is produced by one of those outfits, Archmage Labs, and developed by the other, Archmage Game Studios. Who knows? You know, and maybe the lead programmer's name was like Archmage Programming or something. I don't know. The point is that it's a short, snacky, sort of indie-flavored affair here. And somehow I have managed to sink, 24 hours, 24.7 hours into this game. And I'm probably going to go play it some more after I get done with this. And, I mean, I have to recommend it based on that, even though, okay, here's the thing. All right, you'll be spending 9/10 of your time in this game on two screens. This is one of them, you know, where you're building up your little treasure box that you're putting your weapons into. And the way that you arrange your weapons, like, you know, when you put certain types of weapons next to other types of weapons and objects and stuff like that, it gives you certain buffs. Like, you'll notice here, I'm going with one of my favorite builds, which is the Rogue, and I like to stack the knives together like that. And then you go to this other screen here, where you're just running around the same room, fighting a bunch of enemies. And you're not even really fighting. It's an auto fighter, very similar to, like, I want to say, you know, Vampire Survivors is the go-to term on that, but I think it's probably a little closer to something like Brotato, you know, where you or maybe like Bone Razor Minions, where you're kind of stopping in between rounds to build up your thing. Except it's the rounds have set times. So it's like you run around for a certain amount of time, and then, you know, however many levels you got it, each level equals 2 extra spaces in your treasure box there. And it gives you a random selection of which directions you can expand. It follows like a weird set of rules that I kind of cottoned onto after playing for the equivalent of an entire day, as it were. So, yeah. Like, if I had to point out a reason why this game engaged me so much, it's probably this gameplay right here. Trying to lay things out as best you can, and, you know, trying to figure out the risk and reward of the reroll mechanic that charges you a little bit more with each reroll, and you're trying to get specific items that work with your build and lay them out and have the space to lay them out over the course of these leveling up sessions where you're collecting more money and leveling up to get more spaces in your treasure box. Like, this is the combat part is kind of the least interesting part about it, and yet without that combat, this here, the puzzly part of it, has no context, you know? And all things considered, like I said, there's a part of me that's almost a little ashamed that I spent so much time on this game, because there's not a whole lot to do. It's got the beige room problem, where everything that you are leveling up towards, whether it's within an individual game session or the meta game, where you're buying new weapons and you're upgrading abilities so you can start off in a better place and all that stuff. All of that is to serve the purpose of this room right here. That the only thing that seems to change in it is its general size and dimension. That's it. Occasionally there'll be an obstacle in it, or a couple of spike traps that are they mean almost nothing. You know, this is all it works towards, and yet there's a certain, I don't know, like something that grabs me about, like, just feeling like, oh my goodness, I managed to put the shapes together in such a way that I made this level, which was harder for me the last time, into a total cakewalk. It's a way of sort of getting feedback on solving the puzzle better. It gives you a reason to solve this puzzle or to work on this puzzle. And really, who could ask for anything more? You're really just looking for a justification on this part. Now, you'll notice I'm going with this particular build here with the throwing knives, because the way the throwing knives work is their bonus is every dagger that's put next to them, anything that's classified as a dagger, every one of them that's next to it increases the attack speed by 20%. So if you can get like a whole bunch of them, and I figured out a pattern in one of my previous playthroughs that you can lay the daggers out in, that by the end of the run, you'll see it. Like, it's just going to look like I have a constant stream of knives coming out, because there's like almost no delay after one of the daggers hits its target, and then, you know, the cooldown is so super quick, and then it does the next one. So, but that's like one of like dozens of different strategies you can do. You know, there's such a robustness to the mechanics, all of which are in service to running around this one single room for between 60 and 90 seconds a round. And I don't know, maybe it's, I have no idea why I'm being so cranky about this. I should really just unqualified say, oh no, I like this. But, you know, there's that knee-jerk reaction that want to be too cool for school, where liking something too much is nerdy or whatever. But no, you know what? I unironically think I like this. But at the same time, there are some mitigating factors that drew me to this game, and I feel like those need to be considered as well. The first, and if you remember from last episode when I was talking about how I hurt my hand from just doing a crazy amount of work with it, I've been drawn to playing games that can be played one-handed, that I can use the Steam controller setup thing to make it so I can map the controller in a way that lets me control the entire thing with one hand. And this game, God of Weapons, like, there's not a whole lot that requires manual input aside from moving and selecting things on a menu, which it does this weird thing where some menus you got to press the E button, but other menus the fire button works. It's really strange. I don't know why they made it two different buttons. Nonetheless, the button layout is super easy to just map to I have the trigger for the one, and then like I use the bumper for the back button, which is escape on the keyboard. And then for all those instances where I have to push the E button for whatever reason, I just got that mapped to the D-pad. So I can do the whole thing with my left thumb. It's fantastic. But it also, you'll notice I'm also using the mouse a little bit here for the precision. And it got me thinking that, well, holy cow, this is a really neat way of controlling things. Why don't we have more games that control like that, where you've got the controller in one hand and you use the mouse in the other? Controller and mouse. Like, that would be like a really cool way to play games. I may have to experiment and see if I can make that work with some of my FPS games, and see if I can make that work out. Because that would be like the perfect combination for me. Because I've never liked controlling movement with just the WASD keys, you know? And I prefer the thumbstick. I really do. But at the same time, I cannot argue with the truism that the mouse provides the more accurate aiming experience in your first-person shooter games. So what if you could combine the two? I present to you, technology could make this possible. We can have AIs make us any number of terrible pieces of art, and tell us a bunch of terrible stories. Why can't we have technology that allows us to have a controller in our left hand and a mouse in our right hand to control games with that ultimate precision? And for that matter, I mean, that's just one example, and I admit it's sort of a personal thing. We can certainly do it, I'm sure. I'm just being kind of silly about it, I guess. But the overall thing that this got me thinking about was the accessibility discussion. Now, you know, I don't know if I've brought this up at any time in the past 5 minutes, but I do a little bit of editing for Stephanie Sterling over at the Jimquisition, right? I co-edit those episodes. And one of the discussions that comes up fairly frequently in Steph's work, because Stephanie works with Laura Kate Dale, who does a lot of work with accessibility in video games and things of that nature, does some fantastic work over there. But at the same time, it's like with all these talks of accessibility, it's very easy to say, well, it's nice that accessibility thing exists for the people who need it, right? You know, it's a nice thing to say, and then there's the other side of that argument that always seems to come up, which is, well, why is this accessibility? Why do I have to allow easy mode in Dark Souls, you know, as a form of accessibility, or why do I have to allow, you know, a new control setup in Street Fighter to provide accessibility? It takes fun out of the game for me, or whatever, right? And no concern over the people who might need accessibility, but what it got me thinking about was, here I am playing this God of Weapons game, and like I have a whole list of games I could be playing on Steam. And now that I've kind of had a chance to fool around with Steam's controller thing, you would think that I could sit there and make the controller do whatever I needed to do for all sorts of games, right? And yet I keep coming back to God of Weapons. Why? Because it was pretty accessible right off the bat. You know, there weren't a ton of controls to begin with. It's a game that right out of the box it doesn't take much to make it a game that can be played one-handed. So, it's an accessible game. And because of the state of my right hand at the time, I was in need of accessibility. Now, I realize it's common to say, oh, yeah, well, you know, you don't think about these things till they become an issue for you. You know, it's often said, you know, you'll notice that a lot of people don't start these charities for diseases until they have the disease, right? And, you know, it really got me thinking about that whole principle. Is like, oh, yeah, no, I'm sitting here and I've always like thought of accessibility as, oh, you know, I want there to be accessibility. It's a nice thing to have. And then not really thinking about it more after that. Because it never occurred to me that accessibility isn't just, you know, helping people play video games who only, you know, because of muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy or you know, a major disease that takes out like a bunch of your body. You know, it's not just for them. Accessibility is for human problems that are inevitably going to happen to all of us, right? Like, my eyesight ain't as good as it used to be. I have to wear special glasses now when I game. That's an accessibility issue, right? And maybe I don't necessarily want to go digging around for the special glasses every time. So if a game has an accessibility option that I can just, you know, and it sort of does, you can just turn the resolution down on a lot of games, right? So, you know, on a game where you can turn the resolution down to make things bigger so that people with poorer eyesight can play, that is an accessibility thing that will eventually affect most, if not all of us, right? My hand not working, I mean, arthritis is going to be a thing for a lot of us as we get older. And as we grow up, you know, we're going to still want to play video games. So accessibility is planning for our future in this aspect, right? So this game gave me an opportunity to meditate on the idea that accessibility isn't, you know, it's not just for little Timmy in the wheelchair. It's for all of us. It's planning for your future. And, you know, that's the thing. I was a young person once upon a time, and I remember that I didn't listen to the olds, right? But now I'm the olds, and the young people aren't going to listen to me. Listen. You know, it's the Cassandra cycle. We are going to be crying forth to the younger people. Yes, no, this will be a problem for you eventually, right? Because I've been playing video games for a long time, okay? One of the things I love to say is that my second game console was the one that had wood paneling. I've been gaming that long. My very first game consoles were the Pong machines. You know, the ones with the little prongs you had to stick in the back of the TV and find the right channel, which you had to change with pliers after walking uphill both ways to school and all that stuff. You know, and then the upgrade to the Atari 2600 with its games that you could swap out that were actually different games and not just variations of the same game. Because, you know, when a Pong game said it had 8 games, it was really just 8 different versions of Pong. But the Atari 2600 had dozens of games and hundreds of games, and, you know, on these little cartridges, and a controller with a button on it, which doubled the amount of things you could do with the controller at the time, you know. So, you know, I think about that often, and how, you know, I've been here for all of this evolution in gaming, and I am the first generation of people that has gotten to get old with video games, right? Like when I was growing up, games were just for kids, right? Nowadays, you know, I went through the era, and actually it was funny, I worked customer support and did tech support and stuff over at Nintendo during the period of time when the Wii was living high, right? And that was for a lot of old people their first console. So I got to be there for when old people started playing. And the Wii, very accessible in its own way, right? And so, you would think it would occur to me before now, before the issue affects me as much as it does, that accessibility in video games would be a thing. But here we are, and I'm playing this God of Weapons game, which, again, to be fair, this part of the game here with the puzzle box, very engaging on many levels. I can highly recommend this part of the game, and of course, without the other part of the game to give it context, it would be pointless. And yet, it's fun, right? But more importantly, I don't think I would have sunk as much time into it if my entire Steam list was a lot harder to set up to be played one-handed, right? So, I want to give you kudos for that. I like that it's an accessible game. But I also feel like I'm risking belaboring that point a little bit, so I want to tell you about the other thing that sort of crossed my mind quite a bit while I was playing this, and it's sort of an extension of my surprise from earlier when I was like, how have I played so much of this game? Which is, this game and a lot of other games like it, like I even want to include Gunfield from before, and there's a lot of sort of these like cheesy games that you're not really sure how they got made or what the vision was, and and they come out and they cost between like $3 and $5. Like I want to say this one was like $6, right? It's getting huge positive reviews because you definitely get your money's worth, right? Like it's 1/10 the cost of a AAA game, and it is very content light. Like I said, there's only the one environment, but going back to something I mentioned last week about that whole, well, it's tough to talk about mediocre games thing. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of shows like Squirty Play, Steph did back in the day. Have I mentioned in the past 5 minutes my work with Stephanie Sterling? And the Squirty Play series, a lot of that appealed to me with that is because a lot of these these indie games are very easy to make fun of, right? Because mediocrity, nobody wants to sit there and listen to how mediocre a game is, right? We all want to talk about how, oh, this game looks so janky, and it is so janky, and look, I fell off the side of the world, and, oh, look at all of the Unity assets, and all that stuff, those are fun discussions to have, and I have a feeling that what happens is there is now this stigma that's been created around that, and I think that it speaks to a wider problem, I think, that's going on with video game discourse, which is that young people think this is how you talk about video games now, right? Like, this is, young people, they get started aping the older, cooler people, right? They see what's fun about the thing without really engaging in it. And I admit, for me, a lot of what sort of got me into this world of budget video games is I remember being a member of the Big Rigs community back in the day. There was the Your Winner forums, and I loved those days, but I mean, the whole conceit of the whole thing was the community wouldn't exist in the first place if the whole thing wasn't based on the conceit that budget games are bad. These El Cheapo games, you're not supposed to enjoy them. You're not supposed to enjoy them unironically. They are the thing to be made fun of. You're supposed to hold up a game that's content light and made by nobodies and only cost $4 and say, oh, we're pretending we really like this game, but really we, in reality we don't, or something like that. So, and I think one of the victims of this that got me thinking about was there was an organization called Silver Dollar Games, and I used to fool around a lot with the games that came off of the Xbox Live Indie market. This was back during the Xbox 360. There was they called it XBLI, right? Everybody knows about the Xbox Live Arcade, right? And, that was like sort of where the indie and the small snacky stuff was presented. But there was also XBLI, which was like the super indie kind of stuff. And the reason I think I got into it back in the day was, first off, before Minecraft was available on consoles, the only way to play a Minecraft-like game on consoles was to go to XBLI and find somebody that made their own little version of Minecraft, for super cheap, right? That's how we ended up with things like, what was it, the Castle Miners Z, which was just a classic example of a pile of trash. But anyway, there was this organization, these two brothers, that had a company called Silver Dollar Games, and they gamified everything. They had a game called Try Not to Fart. They had a game called No Luca No, which was just a game where you're batting a cat away from your breakfast. They had Who the Daddy, where you had to figure out who the father of a child was or whatever. Like all of these little El Cheapo games. And they used to get accused of shovelware all the time, which, come on, you're on XBLI. It's all shovelware, right? But the thing is that they later went on to make a game called, what was it? One Finger Death Punch. And One Finger Death Punch should have shut everybody up right at that point, because like here's this company that's known for nothing but trash, right? Like it's basically two brothers in their room making these cheapo weird video games with no greater goal than, we're just going to gamify literally everything and just flood the XBLI with our weird little projects, right? And then they turn around and they make One Finger Death Punch, which came out on the XBLI. That's where it debuted. And some of you out there kind of going, well, I've bought it off of Steam. It's like, yes, you have. One Finger Death Punch made its way to Steam and then became One Finger Death Punch 2, which, frankly, if you haven't played the first one, just skip to the second one. It's roughly the same game. But a lot better and a lot more content. And it is a fantastic game. It is a fighting game that uses only two buttons. It calls itself One Finger Death Punch because you can just use your mouse, right, and just switch between the two. But the point is, it is a super simple stick fighter game. It uses only two buttons. I have a best friend that refers to it as an A-rhythm game because it tries to throw you off with arrhythmic kind of stuff. But a fantastic game. But the thing is, I don't think they could have made One Finger Death Punch if they weren't making a bunch of crap like No Luca No and Try Not to Fart. And that's where my mind starts to come around back to games like God of Weapons, right? Where I look at this God of Weapons game, I'm going, okay, they are throwing together mechanics from other games, right? Like, the assets don't really feel like they go together in a lot of ways. Like, there is some cohesion, but not, there's the glowing blue guys, and then there's, like, these, like, cute little ghost monsters that pop up next to skeletons sometimes, and, so... Like, I sense that there's some pre-bought assets going on here, which may or may not be the case. But the thing is, God of Weapons feels a lot like one of those XBLI games with, like, just better graphics, right? It definitely has that feel to it. Like, a part of it is when you look in the upper left corner while you're in combat, the meters for that are we didn't work too hard on these. There wasn't a lot of work on the UX or the UI, as it were, right? That floor 14 up at the top, very basic kind of stuff going on there. So that's sort of a trademark of those games. It's something I associate with those XBLI, and, later when Steam Greenlight was a thing, you'd see a lot of that with them, and, that same level of stuff, right? So, playing a game like God of Weapons, that's the instinct that gets kicked off for me, right? Like that part of me that's like, oh, this is one of those cheap budget games. I can't like this unironically. I have to make sure that everybody knows that I think this sort of thing is terrible or whatever, But, I couldn't bring myself to do that with this game, for the same reasons as One Finger Death Punch. But there's still a part of me that kind of wants to, because... it's really hard to let go sometimes of those old ways of thinking. It's really hard to look within sometimes and recognize that you've got some inner biases that are possibly preventing you from enjoying life to its fullest. And that's sort of, I think, what happened with me with God of Weapons. It really made me sort of look internally and say, hey, just because a game is, budget and, has some, like, what might be considered glaring flaws on a certain level, and, that sort of thing. And every instinct's telling me I need to say this game is great as a funny joke. But in reality, no, this is right up there with like a bunch of other games. And then I'm looking back at some of those other XBLI games and saying, is it okay to admit that I enjoyed those unironically? Like there was one game on the XBLI I got. I couldn't tell you the developer. This was so long ago. It was called OCD. was the name of the game. And the whole point of the game was that you played all of these pointless little mini games to level up your character, right? The character never got used for anything, right? It was just playing these mini games to get certain colored points and certain colored resources to put into stats for a character. It was sort of a progress quest kind of thing, but like really janky. And I figured out ways to game the system and all this other stuff. And like by every classic like way that you could think of a game, this was not a good game. And I think I am ready to admit to myself and the world that I still enjoyed this game, that I still liked playing it. You know, I enjoyed it unironically. I sunk time into it. I had this expensive games machine that I could play Halo on, or Mass Effect, or any of these like big budget games with stunning graphics. And now I was perfectly happy shuffling around little GIF quality images on little 12 by 12 screens to level up a character that was never going to get used for anything, right? I enjoyed that, and I think I'm ready to admit that it's okay for me to enjoy those sort of things. And perhaps on that note, it's time for me, as a gamer, to offer Silver Dollar Games an apology for all those years I was in agreement with everybody that called them a bunch of shovelware merchants. I was wrong to think that, and they were right to stick it out. And the thing is that they don't even have to acknowledge my apology because they already got their revenge on everybody. You see, if you play One Finger Death Punch or even One Finger Death Punch 2, when you unlock the like harder and harder levels in the survival mode, right? You got the survival mode, and then you get what's called blind survival mode, which takes away the little colored indicators that tells you what the people are going to do. So you have to, you no longer have that like warning what they're going to do. You have to like figure it out while you're right there in the middle of the battle. And once you get to a certain point in that, you unlock the hardest level, which is called No Luca No mode. And that's where you have to play One Finger Death Punch while also playing No Luca No on top of it. Now, as a reminder, No Luca No was probably their most noteworthy game. And I say noteworthy, it was not popular. People did not write strategy games for this hunk of trash because all it consisted of was a picture of breakfast on the screen, and sometimes a cat would come in from the left or the right named Luca. And you had to push your controller either left or right to bat the cat away before it got to your breakfast. Okay? So when you are playing No Luca No mode in One Finger Death Punch, you are playing a full game of One Finger Death Punch that still continues to get harder and harder and harder, but every once in a while a cat pops up on your screen and you have to use your controller to bat the cat away. Now keep in mind that most of us, you figured out a certain way to play the game, whether it's with your mouse or with 2 buttons on your keyboard or 2 buttons on your controller or whatever, but adding the stick to the whole thing is already hard enough. But on top of it all, it's just one big thumbing of their nose at everybody that said No Luca No wasn't going to lead to anything, right? And I really enjoy that. That's the sort of thing that's wonderful. Huge kudos to those fellas. Anyway, back to this particular game, God of Weapons, which, like I said, I've decided I'm going to enjoy unironically. Some of the other builds I've really enjoyed playing in this game. Like, there's a lot of different ways to play it because they really did a good job on a couple fronts. First off, all the weapons sort of do a different thing. Like, for instance, hammers do a little bit of damage sort of in an area around them when they hit, and projectiles tend to have quicker attack. You have your magic weapons or your enchanted weapons, which enchanted weapons are interesting because their damage is partially linked to your recovery ability. And then there's like the one interesting thing about the throwing knives is that they technically count as blades or daggers because they don't feed off of your projectile damage stats. They instead feed off of your melee damage stats. Or melee, or however you pronounce that word. All the years I played those games from Palladium Books, and I still never really quite picked out if it's pronounced melee, or melee. Like, I don't know how to pronounce that. Melee. I do not know how to pronounce it, and at this point, I'm too afraid to ask. But anyway, what's interesting is not only do all the weapons perform differently and operate differently in combat, but the shape that they adopt tends to be a little different as well. Like for example, the more powerful weapons are always more difficult to put in your grid one way or another, maybe because they have a bit poking out or they take on a shape that's a little harder to negotiate. One of the things, like, for example, is that the hammers always face in one direction while the axes always face in another. So if you're going to have a build that has both hammers and axes, it's really hard to just fit them together easily. So you have to account for that. So there's a strategy to building up your treasure box, keeping that in mind and what it is you're trying to do, but at the same time, you don't have total control over which spaces you can pick because it offers you a random selection. And the bigger your box gets, the harder it is to control where those little random bits are going to happen because there's more places where it could possibly happen, right? So, there's a randomness to it that makes it difficult, but some of it's calculated, and then there's the buffs you're getting from the various items you get, and some of them work better if you put them next to other ones, and there's such a complexity to that puzzle game. Probably the same reason I was really into that OCD game back in the day. Puzzles are just great. I think one of the things is, like, I really just miss games like Puzzle Quest that where you were doing puzzles, but they were towards something, right? Like you were building towards something. There was a world outside of the puzzle. Like, wouldn't it be cool if, like, there was like a magic casting game where you had to, like, solve a little puzzle every time, something like that? Well, who knows? It's just something to think about. But anyway, that's really, I think, what makes this gameplay so engaging. And while I would love to see these floors have a little more design to them, and another thing, this game doesn't have an endless mode. That strikes me as odd. This is the kind of game that you'd think would have an endless mode. I have to assume it's probably a resources thing or something like that. Because a lot of times if they're not including an endless mode, it's because they tested it and found out that when you don't put a cap on these things, the numbers get so big that things just start to break in crazy directions. Well, hopefully they can resolve that, or find a way to do it. Because again, this is the kind of game that is just screaming for an endless mode. And it just amazes me. It amazes me that this doesn't have a lot of things. Like, how hard would it have been to put in a second texture just to have a different kind of room, or something like that? It just, I don't know. They're the experts, I guess. Anyway, if you're thinking of getting this game, I want to let you in on some of my pro strats, as it were. You'll notice that it says floor 18 at the top of the screen. The thing is, we're actually going to floor 19. Like, the floor it lists at the top of the screen is the floor you just beat, right? But you do kind of want to pay attention to that, because the thing I have found really helps me out in the final push is paying attention to that number, because when it says floor 19, that is your cue to get rid of all of the items in your treasure box that are related to either gathering resources or gaining experience. Because floor 20 is the last floor, and you're blazing it. Floor 20, blazing it, right? If you catch what I'm throwing down there. If you don't get the joke, don't ask your parents, all right? But they know the answer. You'll just get in trouble for asking. Anyway, when you're coming up on floor 20, you are not going to need the resource gathering stuff so much. You're not going to need experience stuff so much, because resources and experience only are a factor in the puzzle section, and you're not going to head back there. Like, you're either going to win the game or lose the game on floor 20. So, when you're about to go on floor 20, that's your cue. You see floor 19 at the top. That's your cue to sell all your stuff. All right, that's related to resources or getting more experience, and replace them with just whatever you can that's most powerful. Right. The other thing is, by the time you get to floor 10, you need to have a strategy in place for replenishing lost health. There's 3 ways of getting lost health back in this game. There's the vampire thing, they call it lifesteal. There's recovery, which is like natural healing, and then some of the barrels will have food in them. So one of your 3 strategies, and sometimes I'll go with 2. But those strategies involve either getting the horns that generate more barrels so that you have a better chance of getting food, recovery items that up your recovery, and if you're playing a build that uses a lot of enchanted weapons, that one's recommended because your recovery levels also feed into the damage of your weapons, and the lifesteal thing, which is arguably one of the easier ones to get. I end up doing lifesteal with this particular build because when you get your lifesteal percentage up high enough, even if you get it as high as like 25, if you're using a build that is working on getting a really high attack speed, then lifesteal is your best friend because you can get it as high as like 25% and still have a steady, constant, reliable source of healing, and that works faster than recovery. So those are my main strats right there. Another one that's going to help you out there is range. It can help you out a little bit. Now, there is also a way to play this game with manual targeting, and I imagine range probably helps better with that. I wouldn't know. I was using auto targeting because of my one hand. But notice I was still able to pull off the victory. So, anyway, this is God of Weapons. I had a lot more fun with it than I thought I was gonna, and I guess that's a hearty recommend from me. So thanks for hanging out with me for a bit here. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for your time. Bye-bye.